Title: Whispers of the End. Chapter 1: The Arrival of the Shadows. There was nothing remarkable about the town at first glance. It sat, cradled by the mountains, the kind of place where time moved slowly, as though it had forgotten the urgency of the modern world. Streets were narrow, houses quiet, and the air was thick with the scent of damp earth, as though it were a place in between, a forgotten corner where shadows stretched long but never fully embraced the sun. But shadows, like the truth, are not always what they seem. I arrived in silence, unnoticed, perhaps because, after all, I am not easily seen. Or perhaps it is because I have been here longer than anyone could ever know. The first whisper of my presence came not from a sound, but from a strange, subtle shift in the town's rhythm. The leaves in the trees stopped rustling. The hum of the power lines grew faint. The laughter of children, that innocent noise that had once filled the streets, fell silent. It wasn't an abrupt silence, but rather a gradual one, like the slow death of a heartbeat. In a town like this, people notice eventually when something is wrong. But by then, it is far too late. They speak of me, but they don't know my name. They try to find an explanation, to attribute the strange happenings to something, anything, but never the truth. How could they? After all, they are blind to what is always right in front of them. I've always existed, though you might not think so. You, dear reader, are much like them, aren't you? You hear things that don't make sense, but you pass them off as coincidence. A flicker in the corner of your eye, a shadow that seems just a little too thick, just a little too dark to be natural. You brush it off because you must. To acknowledge the darkness is to invite it into your own thoughts, your own soul. I am the darkness, and I am patient. It began slowly, as all things do. A series of strange events, a misplaced object here, a door that would not open there. At first, it seemed nothing more than the quirks of a small town. People were used to these things. There was no need to worry when a light flickered or a clock stopped ticking at the stroke of midnight. These things were just part of living in a place where time had no urgency, but they were just the beginning. I touched this place, ever so gently, in the places where their eyes could not reach. The first to notice was Olivia, an old woman who lived alone in a ramshackle house at the edge of the town. She had seen enough in her life to know that things weren't always as they seemed. Her eyesight was fading, and her steps were slow, but she could still feel the difference in the air, the way the world seemed to hang in a delicate, unnatural stillness. Her cats began to act strangely, hissing at corners where no one stood, clawing at the walls in a frenzy, as though trying to tear apart the fabric of something invisible. Olivia, with her sagging eyes, noticed the shift first, but she couldn't put it into words. The town laughed at her. It was only a matter of time before people stopped believing her completely, before her warnings became nothing more than the ramblings of an old woman. She could not even make them understand what she had seen. But I saw her. I always see them all. The next was Elliot, a young man who worked at the local butcher shop. He had a peculiar talent for carving meat with an artist's touch, though it was something he never spoke of. No, Elliot's obsession was not with his craft. It was with the knife itself. He would trace the blade with his fingers late into the night, his mind drifting far from the cutting boards and raw meat he worked with. I often lingered near him, just out of sight, and watched as his fixation deepened. He began to hear things, small voices that would whisper just at the edge of his hearing. He could never make them out, but he knew their tone. It was familiar, comforting even. The first time he heard it, while holding the cleaver, he nearly dropped it in shock. But as the days went on, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They weren't words at first, just a melody, a gentle beckoning. But Elliot listened. He listened too long, and he began to see things. He saw me, not with his eyes, not in the way you might think, but with his mind, his soul, his very essence. He saw shadows, nothing more than dark spots in the corners, half-formed figures in the periphery. They never quite made sense, but they were there, and they wanted him. Elliot started to change. He began to sleep less, his nights consumed with visions of blackened skies and twisted shapes. His hands trembled with a hunger that could not be sated, and it wasn't long before he found himself carving things, carving symbols into the flesh of his work, carving shapes into the wooden counter where he would place his tools. The town thought nothing of it, of course. People will always dismiss the madness in front of them. The butcher's knives had always been sharp, after all. It wasn't until the storm came that the town began to notice something was wrong. The wind picked up suddenly, violently one evening, just as the sun dipped behind the hills. No one had expected it. It was supposed to be a calm night, with just a light breeze drifting through the streets. But the wind howled, a terrible cry that seemed to pierce the very air itself. It rattled the windows, it bent the trees to the breaking point, and it roared like the shriek of a dying animal. People ran for cover, securing their windows, locking their doors, but even as they huddled in their homes, they couldn't escape the feeling that something was drawing nearer. A presence, unseen, yet undeniably real. A feeling that hung in the air like a storm cloud. A sense of dread that clung to their skin. And that was when the first shadow appeared. It wasn't a shape that could be easily described. It didn't belong to any living creature, nor was it the product of some natural event. It was the kind of shadow that moves against the light, that defies logic and reason. It crawled across the town, slithering through alleys and behind buildings. It was a thing that was felt more than seen, a presence that made the air grow thick and suffocating. Those who ventured outside saw it, briefly, before retreating into their homes with a trembling breath, knowing in their hearts that something had shifted. The shadow wasn't bound to any one form. It morphed, like a liquid, crawling under doors, through cracks, up the walls. It didn't linger. It never stayed in one place for too long, but its touch was everywhere. People began to speak in hushed voices, eyeing their neighbors with suspicion. It was as though the shadow had seeded fear into their hearts. Not the fear of a monster, but the fear of something else, something more ancient and insidious. That was the night when I began my work. The shadow was my first gift to the town, my first sign of arrival, but there would be more, much more. And by the time the final piece fell into place, it would be too late to stop me. As the storm raged that night, the wind carrying a sharp, biting chill, something else stirred beneath the surface of the town. A low hum seemed to pulse beneath the streets, an unnatural vibration that made the floorboards creak in rhythm with its thrum. The hum, subtle at first, grew louder as the night wore on, vibrating in the bones of every living creature. Those who lay awake, whether in their beds or huddled in fear, felt the resonance in their chest, as though the very air was being warped by something ancient, something eternal, but no one spoke of it. The storm, after all, was a spectacle, a rare and frightening thing. People had enough to fear, and yet, I was the one they should have feared most. The town went quiet after that night, in a way that felt wrong. The days became heavier, as though the very atmosphere had thickened, pressing down on every soul that still remained. A kind of staleness settled over the air, a dampness that soaked into the very bones of the town. The kind of quiet where every creak of a floorboard, every gust of wind, every shift in the shadows felt like a threat. It wasn't until the following week that the first of the disappearances occurred. Elliot, the butcher, was the first to vanish. It was a quiet departure, a vanishing with no explanation, no sign of struggle. His co-workers at the butcher shop noticed it first. His knife, the one he used for the cleaver work, was left behind on the counter, gleaming under the flickering fluorescent lights. He had gone, without a word, without a trace. No one knew where he had gone, or why he had left, and his family could offer no answers. His disappearance wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. The whispers began again, not in the corners of the butcher shop, but in the wind itself. They were subtle at first, but persistent. People began hearing soft, disembodied voices on the streets, murmurs, low and hushed, as if the very town were breathing. Some claimed to have heard names, others claimed to hear the faint sound of crying. At times the voice would seem so real, so close, that it would freeze the blood of those who heard it. The whispers were always just out of reach, but they were unmistakable. In the dead of night, when the wind howled and the shadows stretched impossibly long, the whispers became clearer. The town, of course, dismissed it as superstition, but I saw them, saw how their lives twisted slowly, inevitably, under my influence. Every glance over their shoulder, every step they took out of their homes, every subtle shift in the air. They were all reactions to something they could not see, something they could not name, but something they instinctively feared, and yet they did nothing. Fear, when it is not confronted, is as slow as a poison, silent and steady until it consumes the mind entirely. It didn't take long for the others to notice. A few days after Elliot disappeared, Mara, the local historian, found herself standing in front of the town's small library, staring at its weathered walls. She had heard the stories before, of course, but these were different. They weren't just rumors of strange occurrences, of lost souls wandering the streets. They were the beginning of something larger, something that had been set into motion long before any of them had realized it. It wasn't just the storm or the sudden disappearances that unsettled her. It was the sense that this town had been marked, chosen, long ago. That night, she stayed in the library, poring over books older than her own existence. Her fingers trembled as she flipped through ancient pages, each one more foreboding than the last. The names of forgotten gods and forgotten evils, prophecies buried beneath layers of dust. It was there, in the brittle yellowed pages, that she first found it. The name, the Whisperer. She didn't understand it at first, this name written so cryptically in the pages of history. It was more of a title than a name, and it seemed to be connected to every catastrophe the world had ever known. From the ancient plagues to the fall of empires, to every disaster that had shaped the course of human history, the Whisperer was always there, in the background, unseen yet present. And now, it had come to this small town. Mara tried to ignore the gnawing sense of dread that clung to her as she read. It was only when she looked up from the book, her heart racing, that she realized the air had grown colder. Colder than it should have been for a late spring evening. Her breath fogged in front of her face, and the shadows in the room grew darker, more pronounced. She could hear the whispers again, just behind her ear, like a breath on her neck. You know what must be done. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more of a feeling, a presence like a weight pressing against her chest. The knowledge that something terrible was waiting just beyond the veil, ready to consume everything. The door to the library creaked, though no one was there, and for the first time in her life, Mara knew she wasn't alone. As the town's whispers grew louder, its people grew more paranoid, more fearful. But still, they did nothing. They refused to confront the truth of what was happening, perhaps because they didn't know what to do with it. They tried to return to their normal routines, but the fear gnawed at their insides like a constant hunger. The townsfolk gathered in groups, spoke in hushed tones, but never spoke of the same thing. I had already begun to mark them, to sow the seeds of their destruction. Olivia's cats, those curious creatures, started to disappear one by one. She found them, lifeless, piled in strange patterns around the house. They had been drained of all life, their eyes wide open, unblinking, as though they had witnessed something they could never understand. Her eyes, too, began to dull. The woman who once clung to life now seemed to slip further into the shadow, her spirit fading with every passing day. But I saw her. I saw all of them. And soon, they would see me too. Chapter 2. The Binding of the Shattered Souls. The wind howled outside, its violent breath scraping against the windows of the old library. Mara sat motionless, her fingers trembling over the ancient text. The Whisperer had long been a legend, a whispered name spoken only in fear, but the pages before her seemed to hold the truth, cold, indifferent, and inescapable. Her heart pounded in her chest, a steady drumbeat that matched the rhythm of the storm outside. The clock on the wall ticked, each second dragging like an eternity, but it was not time that haunted her. It was the weight of the silence. The whispers were gone now, drowned out by the howling wind and the crackle of the fire in the hearth. But Mara could still feel them, deep within her, like a presence, a dark force creeping through the cracks of her mind. The pages she had turned were filled with symbols, unfamiliar sigils that seemed to pulse with life. These symbols, she realized, were not just marks of ancient knowledge. They were a curse, a binding spell, etched into the fabric of the world itself, forged in the depths of some forgotten age. And the Whisperer, he was the one who had written them. He was the one who had bound the world to his will. The ancient tome slipped from her hands, landing softly on the floor, but Mara could not move. She sat, staring at the fireplace, as though frozen by an unseen hand. Her eyes seemed to blur, her vision narrowing, as if the world around her was slowly dissolving into mist. It had begun. The town, once so vibrant and full of life, now seemed to pulse with a sickly rhythm, like a dying heart struggling for breath. The buildings, once sturdy and reliable, now appeared as though they might crumble under the weight of the air itself. The streets felt hollow, empty, even though the people still walked them. But they weren't the same anymore. Their faces had begun to twist, becoming gaunt, hollow-eyed, empty vessels that moved with a strange, unnatural grace. The first to feel the full weight of this transformation was Olivia. Her house, which had once been filled with laughter and the comforting sound of purring cats, now stood silent and lifeless. Her mind had unraveled, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but a shell of the woman who had once lived there. She wandered the streets, her eyes vacant, her movements jerky and erratic. No one spoke to her. No one dared to. And yet, the town was becoming a place of whispers, both real and imagined. The very air seemed to hum with an energy that no one could understand, an energy that clung to the skin like a fever. People were drawn to the shadows, to the places where the light failed to reach. The children, once so carefree, now avoided the corners of the town where the shadows seemed to grow longer and darker with every passing day. There were no more smiles, no more laughter, only the gnawing fear that something was coming, something vast, something ancient. Mara could feel it too. She could feel the pull of the curse, the way it wrapped itself around her like an invisible chain, binding her to the fate of the town. The pages she had read spoke of an unholy ritual, one that would ensure the Whisperer's return. But it also warned of a terrible price. To summon him back was to offer up the souls of the living, to make the town itself a vessel for his dark power. Mara had always thought herself immune to superstition. She had spent her life studying history, unraveling the mysteries of the past. But the deeper she delved into the town's forgotten lore, the more she understood. This was no mere myth. This was real, and the price was already being paid. A corruption. The disappearance of Elliot had been the first sign, but it was Olivia's descent into madness that truly marked the beginning of the town's unraveling. And as the days wore on, others followed in her footsteps, each person slipping further into the grasp of the Whisperer, their identities fading like distant stars swallowed by the night. But not all were lost. There were whispers of a woman, an old woman, living on the edge of town, far from the crumbling heart of the village. They called her the Seer, a name passed down from the old days when magic still had a place in the world. She was said to know the secrets of the Whisperer, to have knowledge of how to banish him from the world once and for all. But whether the Seer's power was enough to stop the curse, or whether she was simply another victim in the making, no one knew. But Mara knew she had to find her. It was under the cover of night that Mara ventured into the wilderness, drawn by an invisible force she could not explain. The wind had died down, and the air felt still, oppressive, as if the world itself was holding its breath. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their twisted branches reaching out like claws, scratching at the sky. The path was difficult, winding through dense thickets and brambles. The earth beneath her feet felt wrong, as though it were made of something other than soil, something ancient, something dead. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig beneath her boots. Finally, she reached the small, decrepit cottage nestled deep in the woods. Its walls were covered in vines, its windows dark and lifeless. The door creaked open as if it had been waiting for her. Inside, the Seer sat in the shadows, her gnarled hands folded in her lap. Her eyes, pale and unfocused, seemed to look through Mara, as though she could see not just the present, but the very fabric of time itself. "You have come," the Seer's voice rasped, as though the words had been buried beneath years of dust. "You seek to undo what has already been set in motion." Mara nodded, fear tightening in her chest. "What is happening? Why is this town dying?" The seer's lips curled into a faint, bitter smile. The Whisperer has awoken. He was always here, waiting, hidden beneath the surface. And now the town belongs to him. But how? Mara whispered, her voice shaking. How can we stop it? The seer closed her eyes, and for a long moment Mara thought she had fallen asleep. Then the old woman spoke again, her voice a mere breath on the wind. You cannot stop it. The curse is bound to the land, to the people, to you. The only way to break it is to give him what he desires. As Mara left the cottage, her heart heavy with the seer's words, the full weight of her reality settled upon her. The town was lost. There was no escape. The Whisperer was everywhere, woven into the very fabric of their existence. The seer had been right. The curse could not be undone, not without sacrifice. And as Mara walked back through the oppressive night, she knew one thing for certain. The Whisperer had already claimed them all, and soon he would come for her, too. Chapter 2. The Binding of the Shattered Souls continued. Mara's feet dragged through the endless stretch of twisted trees, the thick air pressing down on her like a suffocating blanket. The wind had returned, but it wasn't the usual cold gusts that whipped through the branches. It was thick, laden with an unnatural weight. The whispers were gone, but the silence itself seemed to hum, vibrating in her chest. It was as if the land had been cursed to stand still, frozen in some horrible moment of time. The seer's words echoed in her mind like a dull throb, resonating deeper than she cared to admit. The curse is bound to the land, to the people, to you. There had been no escape from this fate, she understood now. The town was not just dying. It was being consumed, devoured by something ancient, something terrible. And Mara was a part of it. Her thoughts churned as the path before her twisted in on itself, leading her deeper into the heart of the forest. She was far from the town now, far from the streets that had once seemed so familiar. There was nothing around her but the darkness, the oppressive weight of a sky that no longer felt like it belonged to this world. In the distance, the faint glow of lantern light from the seer's cottage had disappeared, swallowed whole by the night. But then, something shifted. A low murmur reached her ears. It was a sound that could have been mistaken for the wind, except it wasn't. The sound grew louder, more distinct. A voice, one she did not recognize, but whose cadence felt achingly familiar. It was calling to her, coaxing her into the unknown. A chill ran down her spine as her breath hitched in her throat. The Whisperer. She stopped in her tracks, heart thundering, and listened closely. The voice, soft and seductive, slithered into her consciousness like a cold, invasive fog. Come closer, Mara. It is too late to turn back now. Her feet felt as if they were moving on their own accord, driven by a force far greater than her will. The voice twisted around her thoughts, a siren's call pulling her deeper into the woods. It was not the Whisperer himself, she realized, but one of his servants, one of the lost souls who had been consumed by his dark power. They were always there, lurking in the shadows, watching, waiting. And now, one had found her. The forest seemed to open before her, revealing a path she had not seen before. The trees parted like an invitation, their gnarled limbs curling in the wind, beckoning her forward. Her legs moved, not of their own accord, but compelled by some unseen force. Every step she took felt like an inch closer to something horrible, something that had been waiting for her. The air thickened as she walked, until it seemed as though she was wading through a dense fog. The world around her began to distort, the ground beneath her feet shifting and warping. Shadows stretched unnaturally, twisting into grotesque shapes that seemed to reach out for her, grasping at the edges of her vision. As Mara moved deeper into the woods, the whispers grew louder, now more than one voice, all speaking in unison. They spoke of despair, of an eternal dark, of a fate she could not escape. The town was not merely suffering, it was transforming, changing into something grotesque, something dead, and she was the key to its final fall. And then, as she rounded a corner of the winding path, she saw it. A clearing opened before her, bathed in an eerie, pale light. The trees that surrounded the clearing were twisted and blackened, their leaves a dark, unnatural hue. In the center of the clearing stood a stone altar, old and weathered, its surface cracked and worn. Strange runes had been carved into the stone, glowing faintly in the light, pulsing with a rhythm that matched the thrum in her chest. At the foot of the altar lay a figure, motionless. Mara stepped closer, her heart pounding in her chest, a feeling of dread seeping into her bones. She knew what lay before her. The seer's words had warned her. This was no simple altar. This was where it had all begun. The figure was not human, not anymore. It was a man, but his face was twisted in agony, his skin stretched and pale, as though he had been drained of life. His eyes were wide open, but they stared out blankly, no longer seeing. The sight was grotesque, and yet there was something chillingly familiar about him, something that made Mara's blood run cold, and then it hit her. This man, this creature, was one of the first, one of the very souls that the Whisperer had consumed. He was a warning, a symbol of what she might become if she failed to stop him. She knew with a terrible certainty that this was her future if she did not find a way to break the curse. The altar was calling to her, urging her to take the final step, but Mara refused to move closer. She could not touch that cursed stone, could not allow herself to be bound to whatever dark fate it promised. Her breath quickened as she stepped back, but the voice in her head continued, relentless. You cannot escape what you are. You will serve me just like the rest. Mara's pulse raced, her legs trembling beneath her. The air thickened with malevolent energy, and she felt the ground tremble beneath her feet. The Whisperer's presence was upon her, suffocating, clawing at her mind. The darkness wrapped itself around her like a shroud, pulling her toward the altar. But Mara fought it, summoning every ounce of willpower she had. She had to break free. She had to find the strength to resist, or else she would become another lost soul, another victim. Her hand reached out, her fingers trembling as she touched the rough bark of a nearby tree for support. The ancient wood pulsed with an energy that felt alien to her, but she clung to it, using it to steady her resolve. She could not give in to the fear. She would not. The voice in her mind seemed to scream louder now, a cacophony of madness and rage. You belong to me, Mara. There is no escape. But Mara refused to listen. She turned on her heel, her eyes never leaving the altar. The path out of the clearing was blurred by the shifting shadows, but she pushed forward, moving faster now, almost running, until she burst through the edge of the forest and back into the open. The wind slammed into her, harsh and cold, as if the world itself were punishing her for leaving. She could hear the voice trailing after her, but it was faint now, distant. She could almost breathe again, but the truth lingered, heavy and suffocating. She had not escaped. She had only bought herself time. Chapter 3. The Watchers in the Dark. Mara's heart continued to pound as she stumbled back into the shadow of the forest, each step heavier than the last. The woods were no longer just dark. They were alive, their pulse in rhythm with her own, an oppressive weight that seemed to press down on her chest. Her breath came in shallow gasps, but no matter how quickly she moved, the creeping sensation of being watched never left her. The feeling grew stronger the farther she went, until it felt as if the very trees themselves were turning their gaze upon her. She quickened her pace, her boots crunching against the underbrush. Every sound around her, every rustle of the leaves, every snap of a twig underfoot, seemed amplified, as if the forest itself were trying to speak, trying to warn her, trying to pull her deeper into its grasp. The path twisted and bent, as though it were alive, shifting to lead her toward some unknowable destination. Mara could no longer distinguish between the real world and the world that lurked just beyond it. Shadows, strange and unnatural, danced around her, stretching and twisting with every flicker of the moonlight. The air grew thick with an unnatural chill, a biting cold that sank deep into her bones. In the distance, something shimmered, pale and ghostly. At first, it was barely perceptible, but as Mara strained her eyes, it became clearer. A figure, the silhouette of a person, standing still and motionless, its outline glowing faintly against the backdrop of the trees. Mara froze. She knew better than to approach without caution, But her body betrayed her, pulling her forward. Her legs moved on their own, as if the figure had cast a spell over her, forcing her to come closer. She tried to resist, tried to turn back, but it was as if the very earth beneath her feet had become liquid, unyielding and unrelenting. As she drew nearer, the figure came into sharper focus. It was a woman, draped in tattered white robes that fluttered in a wind that Mara could not feel. Her hair was long and dark, flowing like ink in the moonlight. The woman's face was obscured by a veil, a mask of shadows that seemed to breathe and shift with the night. Mara's breath caught in her throat. There was something about this woman, something ancient and unearthly. Her presence felt as if it had existed here for centuries, and the earth itself had borne witness to her slow, unyielding presence. "Mara," the voice whispered, its tone low and haunting, like the echo of a forgotten dream. It was the voice she had heard earlier, the voice that had beckoned her to the altar. Mara's knees weakened, and she collapsed to the ground, unable to look away from the figure. She opened her mouth to speak, but no sound escaped. Her throat was dry, constricted by an invisible force. The air around her grew colder still, and she shivered as a dark fog began to roll in, creeping from the edges of the clearing. "You have come far, child," the figure said, her voice rasping like dry leaves being crushed underfoot. Too far, perhaps. Mara tried to steady her breath, but it felt as if the very atmosphere was closing in around her. Who are you?" she managed to rasp, her voice barely more than a whisper. The woman tilted her head, her mask of shadows shifting. For a brief moment, Mara thought she saw eyes, glowing, hollow eyes staring back at her from the darkness. "I am but a messenger," the woman replied, her voice like the wind through the trees. "I carry the truth you seek, but it comes at a price you may not be willing to pay." A sickening feeling churned in Mara's stomach. The price, the cost. She had felt it before, in the dark corners of her mind, a sense that everything she did, every step she took, only brought her closer to an inevitable end. "What truth?" she asked, her voice trembling, but her will strong. "What is happening to this town, to me?" The woman's laugh was soft, almost musical, but laced with a bitter edge. "You already know the answer, child. The town, it is being consumed, but not by what you think. It is not the land that is cursed. It is the souls of its people, trapped in an endless cycle, a cycle of their own making." Mara's mind raced. She thought back to the town, the faces of the people she had known. They had seemed so ordinary, so normal, and yet now she understood. There was something wrong beneath the surface, something waiting. "The Whisperer?" Mara asked. "Is he the cause of all this?" The woman's lips twisted into something resembling a smile, though it was devoid of warmth. "Yes, he is both the cause and the effect. You see, Mara, the Whisperer is not just a man. He is the embodiment of the curse that binds this land, the curse that binds all who live here." Mara shuddered, her mind struggling to process the weight of the words. The curse, the Whisperer, it was all one and the same. She was no longer dealing with a mere spirit. This was something much older, much darker. The very essence of the land itself had been tainted by him. "He wants me," Mara whispered, finally understanding. "He wants me to join him." The woman's eyes, if they could be called eyes, narrowed, her shadowy veil rippling like water disturbed by a stone. "He has wanted you for a long time, child. You are the key. You always have been." Mara's pulse quickened, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. She stepped back, her mind reeling. "No, I won't be his. I won't let him take me." The woman's laughter faded into the wind, and she raised a hand, a long skeletal finger pointing directly at Mara. "You have no choice, child," she said, her voice a venomous hiss. "You are already his. You belong to the curse. All that remains is for you to accept it." Suddenly, the world around Mara seemed to shift. The trees bent, their trunks snapping and groaning under some unseen weight. The sky darkened further, and the ground beneath her feet began to tremble. Something was coming. Something ancient, something powerful, was rising from the earth. The woman stepped back, her form dissolving into the fog, her voice echoing one final time, like the last whispers of a dying dream. The curse will consume you, Mara. There is no escaping the darkness that is already inside you. Chapter 4. Beneath the Surface. The night wrapped itself tighter around Mara as she stumbled through the dense fog, her senses overwhelmed by the cold, damp air that clung to her skin like a shroud. The woman, or whatever she had been, had vanished as quickly as she had appeared, leaving only the lingering echo of her cryptic words in the air. The curse, the whisperer, the key. Mara didn't understand everything, but she knew one thing with a sickening certainty. She was caught in something far larger than herself, something that had been waiting for her long before she ever stepped foot in this forsaken town. Her footsteps faltered as the ground beneath her seemed to grow more unstable. The earth was no longer solid, but something beneath it, something ancient, stirred. She had always known there was something wrong with this place, something wrong with the people, but now it felt like the land itself was alive, shifting, waiting. Mara stopped. The wind carried a faint scent, sharp and metallic, like rust, but it was the smell of decay. Her eyes scanned the horizon, but the fog had thickened, turning everything into a blur of indistinct shapes. The trees, once towering and proud, now loomed like twisted skeletons, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, beckoning her closer. The sound of whispers floated in the air, faint but unmistakable. They were distant at first, barely perceptible, but as Mara strained to hear, the voices grew louder, a chorus of muted murmurs, so many that it seemed the very air was alive with their voices. She could make out nothing, not their words, not their tone, but the sheer volume of them, an overwhelming cacophony, was enough to make her head spin. She had to stop them. What are they saying? She pressed her hands to her ears, but it did little to block out the sound. The whispers grew into an unbearable roar, then into a wail that scraped against her very soul. Mara staggered back, the noise pushing her deeper into panic. Then a voice, clear, commanding, rose above the rest. She is here. The words struck her like a slap, and she froze, the blood draining from her face. She turned toward the source of the voice, her legs trembling as they carried her forward against her will. Something told her she shouldn't look, shouldn't follow, but the pull was irresistible, a slow and deliberate force, like the tug of gravity itself. The fog parted slightly, revealing an old well, half buried under thick vines and brambles. The stone walls of the well were cracked and weathered, eroded by centuries of time and neglect. At the base, there was no water, only a deep, pitch-black void that seemed to absorb the light around it. The whispers came from within, crawling up from the depths like insects. Is this where it all began? Mara's chest tightened. She could hear the sound of breathing now, slow, deliberate, as if something were waiting inside. She didn't want to get closer. Everything inside her screamed to turn away, but she couldn't. Her feet moved, as though they had a mind of their own, and she found herself standing at the edge of the well, peering down into the abyss below. The air grew colder, colder still. Her breath misted before her face, and she shivered despite herself. She leaned closer to the edge, and in that moment, a flash of movement caught her eye. Her heart stopped. A figure, hunched and malformed, rose slowly from the depths of the well. It was human, almost, but its skin was the color of old ash, its eyes wide and hollow. It had no hair, no discernible features beyond its pale mottled skin and the twisted shape of its limbs. It moved like liquid, its body stretching and shifting in impossible ways. Mara stumbled backward, her mouth dry. She wanted to scream, to run, but no sound escaped her throat. Her body was paralyzed, her eyes locked onto the creature's empty gaze. The thing was coming for her, and there was no escape. A laugh broke the silence, cold and empty, a laugh that seemed to reverberate from the deepest parts of her mind. She recognized the voice. The whisperer. The creature reached out, its fingers long and thin like the tendrils of a creeping vine. It grabbed Mara's wrist with a force that sent shockwaves of pain up her arm. The coldness of its touch seeped through her skin, down to the marrow of her bones, and she gasped in horror. The creature's grip tightened, dragging her toward the well. "No!" she cried, but her voice was drowned by the howling wind that whipped around her. Her feet scraped against the rough stone of the well's edge as she was pulled closer to the abyss. Panic surged in her chest, but it was as though her body no longer belonged to her. She was being taken, pulled deeper into something that was both real and not, a place where the rules of nature and reality had long been forgotten. Her hands grasped at the ground, desperately trying to hold on, but the earth around her was soft, damp with moisture. She could feel the darkness pulling at her, suffocating her. And then she heard it. A voice, calm and knowing, yet as cold as the grave. "You have been chosen." The words filled her mind, echoing through her skull like a drumbeat. Mara's eyes widened. She knew that voice. She had heard it before, on the wind, in the forest, in the dark corners of her dreams. It was the Whisperer, yes, but more than that. It was him, the one who had shaped the curse that twisted this land, the one who had led her here. "You will join us, Mara," the voice continued, its tone soothing. "Like the lullaby of a predator, you will become one of us, a part of the endless cycle." Mara's breath came faster. She wasn't ready for this. She couldn't be. But as the creature's grip on her tightened and the darkness grew thicker, she understood. There was no running. There was no escaping. She was already inside it, already a part of it. With one final, desperate scream, she was pulled into the well. Chapter 5. The Depths of Forgetting. The moment Mara's body hit the cold stone floor, she was aware of the silence. The absence of sound was so profound that it pressed against her eardrums, suffocating her senses. She could feel the weight of the void pressing in, heavier than any physical object, more suffocating than the darkness that surrounded her. Her hands trembled as they reached out, brushing against the rough, jagged surface beneath her. The ground felt real, too real, and yet the silence felt unnatural, as though time itself had stopped. The absence of any familiar sound, the usual hum of the wind or rustle of the trees, left a hollow space that gnawed at the edges of her sanity. She was somewhere between waking and dreaming, a liminal space where nothing was certain. But the whispers were still there, lingering in the air like a persistent echo. Faint, but unmistakable. They began as faint murmurs, soft and indistinct, but soon they grew louder, louder still, until they were no longer whispers but voices. Hundreds, thousands of voices, low and guttural, their cadence reverberating in her skull. "Welcome, Mara," they said in unison, as if they had all been waiting for her. Mara's heart lurched, the words slamming into her mind like a sudden storm. The feeling of 1,000 eyes upon her was overwhelming. She had entered a world that was not hers, one where the rules of reality no longer held sway. It was a place that had existed long before her, long before the town had been built, long before even the land itself had formed. It was the space between breaths, the place where memory and time ceased to exist. She pulled herself to her feet, the ground beneath her warm, pulsing with a rhythm that made her skin crawl. It wasn't Earth. No, it wasn't. She could feel it now. It was something else, alive, a pulsating mass of flesh and sinew that seemed to breathe with her. She staggered backward, her fingers digging into the walls for support. The walls, they weren't walls at all. As her hands scraped across the surface, it gave way, sinking into a soft, spongy material. The walls were living, breathing flesh, wrapping around her like a vast, twisted cocoon. Mara gasped, pulling her hands away in horror, but there was nowhere to escape. The walls seemed to close in around her, and the air grew thick, the scent of decay mixing with the earthy odor of rotting leaves. In the darkness ahead of her, a figure appeared, silent at first, like a shadow slipping between the cracks of the world. As it drew closer, the air itself seemed to grow heavier. Mara's breath caught in her throat as the shape of the figure materialized in front of her. It was like no man she had ever seen, a tall, slender creature cloaked in tattered robes that seemed to move of their own accord, as if alive. Its face was hidden behind a black veil, its features obscured by the deep folds of shadow. but it didn't need to show its face. She knew it. The Whisperer. "I see you've made it." The voice came, soft and cruel, slipping into her mind like a snake. The words were not spoken, but somehow they echoed inside her skull, curling and twisting until they formed shapes she could understand. "You are where you are meant to be, Mara." "Where? Where am I?" Mara gasped, her voice trembling. She could barely speak above a whisper, her throat raw, the words feeling foreign even to her own ears. "Where is a matter of perspective," the Whisperer replied, stepping closer, its form shuddering as though it were made of smoke. "What matters now is who you are. Or rather, who you will become." Mara recoiled instinctively, her breath quickening, her body tensed, ready to flee, but her legs felt like stone. The whispering voices grew louder, the words merging together, as if they were trying to tear at her thoughts, to unravel her very sense of self. "Who you are is irrelevant, little one," the Whisperer murmured. Its veiled face leaned closer to hers, and Mara felt the cold air of its breath brush against her skin. "What matters is the path you will take, the destiny that awaits you." Mara's heart raced. Path? Destiny? Was she supposed to accept this? Accept whatever fate the Whisperer was offering her? No, she couldn't. She wouldn't. But the Whisperer seemed to sense her resistance, and it smiled. Or perhaps it didn't. It was hard to tell. Its face was still obscured, but Mara could feel the shift in the air, the weight of something insidious pressing down on her. "You can resist all you want, Mara," the Whisperer said, its voice now dripping with malice. "But in the end, there is no escape. Not from me. Not from what lies beneath." The words hung in the air, a terrible, suffocating promise. Mara tried to turn away, but the air around her thickened, pulling her back into the center of the room. Her limbs were heavy, as though they were made of lead, and she could barely move. The ground beneath her shifted again, pulling her deeper into the heart of whatever this place was. Suddenly, the walls seemed to tremble. A low rumble echoed through the cavernous space, the vibrations reverberating through her body. A deep, guttural sound rumbled from beneath her feet, louder, closer. It was the sound of something waking, something ancient, something hungry. "Do you hear it?" the Whisperer asked, its voice now sharp with anticipation. "The thing that has been waiting for you, waiting for all of us." Mara didn't answer. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of the flood of terror that was crashing over her. What was that sound? What was the thing beneath them? And then it came. From the shadows ahead, from the depths of the living walls, a terrible, monstrous shape emerged. It was a thing of shifting forms, a mass of twisting limbs, eyes, and mouths that seemed to appear and disappear with every movement. It was impossible to look at it for too long, for the very sight of it made her insides twist and writhe in disgust. The Whisperer's voice was a whisper now, soft, almost tender. "This is what awaits you, Mara. This is what you were always meant to become." Mara felt the bile rise in her throat as the creature slithered closer, its many mouths opening to release a torrent of nauseating sound, like the scream of 1,000 tortured souls. She wanted to scream, to run, to escape, but there was no escape, not anymore. The creature was upon her now, its presence overwhelming, pressing down on her in a way that defied understanding. It was everywhere. It was the walls. It was the air. It was the very ground beneath her feet. And then she understood. It wasn't just a creature. It was the land itself, the dark, twisted force that had shaped everything, that had been here long before she ever arrived. This place, this town, was built on it, fed by it. It had fed on her too, from the very first moment she had stepped into it. And now, Mara was a part of it. "Welcome home, Mara," the Whisperer said, the words reverberating through her bones. "You belong here. You always have." Chapter 5. The Depths of Forgetting, continued. Mara's mind raced, her thoughts tangling together like the fraying threads of a broken tapestry. Home. She tried to force the word from her mind, but it stuck to her consciousness like a festering wound. "This is not my home. This can't be my home." The creature, No, the thing loomed before her, its shape ever shifting. Its many eyes blinked all at once, and its mouths twisted, as if testing the air for the scent of her fear. A low, reverberating hum echoed through her skull, like the sound of some great cosmic engine slowly turning its gears. Each pulse of its grotesque form sent ripples through the space around them, distorting the air, distorting reality itself. The Whisperer's voice followed, slithering into her ears like a shadow, its tone deceptively calm. "You see it now, don't you?" it cooed, as though speaking to a child. "It has always been here. This thing, this force, this essence. It exists in every crack, every shadow of this place. It exists in you too. It is a part of you, Mara." Her heart pounded in her chest, the blood roaring in her ears as she took a step back, though her legs felt like jelly. She stumbled, catching herself against the pulsing wall. The surface beneath her fingers rippled and throbbed, and for a moment, she thought she felt something breathing beneath her touch. "No," she whispered, her throat dry, her voice cracking. "I'm not a part of this. I don't belong here." But even as she said the words, she felt the weight of their falseness pressing down on her. Something in the pit of her stomach told her the truth, that she did belong here, in this warped place where time was fluid, and the air itself seemed to suffocate with the secrets it held. The creature, it, shifted again, its grotesque mass convulsing as if waking from a deep slumber. One of its many eyes blinked slowly, locking onto her with a gaze so intense, so consuming, that Mara felt as if it could see through her, through every memory, every regret, every secret she had buried. "No," she muttered, shaking her head, trying to tear her eyes away, but her body refused to obey. She was trapped in its gaze, frozen, as though some invisible chain had wrapped itself around her heart, squeezing tighter and tighter. The Whisperer's voice, soft and serpentine, filled the space once more. "You cannot escape what you are, Mara. Not from me, not from it, not from what we are. You are the void. You are the emptiness. The same emptiness that exists within me. The same emptiness that shapes the world around you." The weight of the words pressed on her, as if they were not just spoken, but woven into the very air she breathed, like invisible threads pulling her deeper into their grip. She staggered, disoriented, her vision swimming as the room shifted again. The floor seemed to buckle beneath her feet, the walls warping and bending like the soft skin of a living creature. "I am not," she began, her voice barely a whisper, but she couldn't finish the thought. Her words faltered, breaking apart in the crushing weight of her realization. The thing before her was right. It had always been right. She was part of this. Mara could feel it now, creeping into her blood, into her bones. She wasn't just a visitor here. She was woven into its fabric, an extension of the dark, monstrous force that had claimed this place as its own. Her very existence felt like a lie, an intrusion into the twisted narrative that had been unfolding here long before her. As if sensing her internal collapse, the Whisperer moved closer. Its cloak seemed to ripple with a life of its own, whispering the dark promises of this place, of what awaited her, of what she would become. "You are a part of the cycle now, Mara," it said, the words dripping with dark satisfaction. "A part of something ancient, something inevitable. You will remember, soon. You will remember who you were meant to be, what you were made for." Mara stumbled backward, her hands clawing at the living walls, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She couldn't bear it anymore. She couldn't stay here, trapped in this place, surrounded by the suffocating, unnatural presence of the creature. But as she tried to move, her limbs locked in place, as if the very space was holding her captive. The walls began to pulse, faster now, and the ground beneath her feet shuddered. She felt herself drawn toward the center of the room, toward the thing, the force, that had been calling her, pulling her in. Her heart thudded painfully in her chest, each beat a reminder that she was alive, but only just. "You cannot outrun it, Mara," the Whisperer murmured, its voice now a mere whisper in the vast, dark expanse. It is part of you. You have always known this. You will never escape the truth of what you are. The pulsing intensified, the rhythm of it matching her own heartbeat, until it became deafening. She could feel the walls pressing in around her, could feel the weight of everything, the weight of being itself, closing in on her. And then she saw it. Through the writhing darkness, through the sickening form of the creature, she saw something in the distance. A light, faint but undeniable. It flickered like a candle in the wind, struggling to survive in the crushing weight of the shadows. Without thinking, Mara lurched toward it, desperate for escape. Her legs, once heavy and unwilling, now moved with the desperation of someone who had nothing left to lose. The light was her only chance, her only hope. She pushed forward, her breath ragged, her hands outstretched toward the flickering glimmer that seemed to pulse with life. But as she drew closer, the light seemed to shift, moving farther away from her reach. Every time she thought she was close, it pulled back, farther into the distance, just out of reach. Her heartbeat quickened, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Panic clawed at her insides, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't turn back. Then she felt something. Cold fingers brushed against her skin, and her body jerked in shock. She spun around, but there was no one there. Just the darkness. Just the walls, alive and breathing, pulsing with a rhythm that echoed her heartbeat. The light was gone now. Vanished. Mara collapsed to the ground, her limbs shaking uncontrollably. She had failed. There was no escape, no way out. The truth had swallowed her whole. And as she knelt there, trembling in the oppressive darkness, the Whisperer's voice came again. Colder now. Final. You are mine, Mara. Always have been. Always will be. Chapter 6. The Inheritance of Shadows. Mara's hands shook as she rose from the ground, her limbs stiff and uncooperative. The whispering presence of the creature, the Whisperer, lingered in the air, a cold and suffocating shroud. It felt as though every corner of this place was watching her, every surface listening. The darkness, which had once seemed like a mere absence of light, now pressed in on her, solid and alive, wrapping around her like an endless, insidious fog. She couldn't escape it. Her chest rose and fell erratically, each breath a desperate gasp, as though the air itself were trying to suffocate her. Her pulse thudded in her ears, louder than the sound of her thoughts, louder than the whispers that continued to echo in her skull. You're not free. The voice of the Whisperer curled around her mind like a living thing. There is nowhere to go, no place to hide. Mara closed her eyes, pressing her palms against her temples, hoping to block out the sound, to find some space for herself, somewhere far from the oppressive weight of its voice. But when she opened them again, she found that she hadn't moved. She was still standing in the center of the chamber, surrounded by the writhing, pulsating walls that seemed to ripple with a life of their own. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, suffocating in its quiet. She was trapped. A feeling of dread began to seep through her veins, slow and insidious. The room began to distort again, its walls bending and twisting in ways that defied nature. The floor beneath her feet felt soft, like a layer of damp moss, and the ceiling above her seemed to stretch far beyond her line of sight, endless and oppressive. This isn't real, she told herself, her voice trembling inside her mind. This can't be real. But even as she thought those words, the air grew heavier. She could feel the presence of something ancient stirring in the corners of this distorted world. The shadows themselves seemed to hum with anticipation, as if waiting for something to unfold. Something that had been waiting for her, for this moment. Suddenly, the walls around her shuddered violently, sending a ripple through the space. A low guttural sound filled the room, like the groaning of an immense unseen entity. She stumbled backward, her heart racing. Then, there was a shift, a flicker in the air. Something otherworldly was approaching. No, please, not again. From the darkness emerged a figure. At first, it was just a silhouette, a shadow in the periphery of her vision. Then, as it stepped into the dim light, Mara felt her blood run cold. It was her, but it wasn't. The figure before her was an impossible reflection. The face was hers, but twisted, distorted, an uncanny mockery. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, as though it had been drained of life. Her hair hung in tangled, unkempt strands, and her eyes, wide and hollow, stared out with an intensity that was not her own. Her expression was vacant, yet it radiated a deep, suffocating sorrow, like a ghost trapped in its own skin. The reflection spoke. "You don't belong here!" Mara recoiled, but the figure moved closer, its steps slow and deliberate, as though drawn by some invisible force. Her heart pounded in her chest, a wild drumbeat of panic. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet felt rooted to the floor. She was frozen, unable to move. The reflection of Mara reached out, its hand hovering just inches from her face, cold and unfeeling. "You are me," it whispered, its voice a hollow echo of her own. "We are the same, Mara. You can never escape me, because you are the one who called me here." Her breath caught in her throat. "Called me here." Those words twisted in her mind like a knife. Called me here. She didn't understand. She had done no such thing. She had never invited this thing, this reflection, into her life. But even as she denied it, she felt the truth settling over her like a shroud. A dark, unrelenting truth that had been waiting to be unearthed. Her reflection was no mere illusion. It was a part of her, something that had always been inside her, a dark seed planted deep within her soul. Mara backed away, her eyes never leaving the twisted figure, but it only followed, its expression never changing, its eyes filled with something she couldn't quite comprehend. "Why are you here?" Mara's voice was small, tremulous, as though speaking the words aloud might somehow make them true. The reflection paused, as if considering her question, and then, with a chilling smile, it replied, "You brought me here, Mara. You've always been here with me. We are born from the same place, the same emptiness. Your fear, your rage, your doubts, they called me into being, and now I am all that remains, all that ever was." Mara's throat tightened. The thing in front of her was her. But it wasn't. It was a twisted version of herself, a nightmare made flesh. But more than that, it was the manifestation of all her darkest fears, all the parts of herself that she had never acknowledged, never confronted. "You can't be me," she whispered, shaking her head. "You can't be. I'm not like you." But the reflection just laughed, a soft, hollow sound that reverberated through the room like a death knell. "You are more like me than you realize, Mara. You always have been. All that you've hidden, all that you've feared, all that you've tried to bury, it's me. It's always been me, and you are me." The room seemed to shrink, the walls pressing in closer, the shadows growing deeper. Mara felt the crushing weight of the words as if they were something tangible, something that could suffocate her. The figure of herself reached forward again, its fingers cold and unfeeling, brushing against her cheek with the gentleness of a lover, a predator, all in one. She wanted to scream. She wanted to run, to flee. But her body refused to obey. The darkness had a grip on her now, pulling her down, pulling her towards something far deeper, far older than she could possibly understand. And as she felt herself being dragged further into the abyss, she understood. This was not just about escaping this place. This was not about running away from the whisperer, or the creature that lurked in the corners of her mind. This was about accepting the truth, that there was no escape, no running, no fleeing from what she had become, no fleeing from what they had made her. And with that realization, she was lost. Chapter 6. The Inheritance of Shadows continued. The reflection's laughter echoed through the hollow chamber, wrapping around Mara like chains made of ice. It reverberated in her chest, each sound more oppressive than the last. Her vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes, yet she couldn't tear her gaze away from the twisted figure. It was her, yet not. It was the darkest part of her, the fragment of her soul that had been buried so deeply, she had long forgotten it existed. And now it stood before her, a grotesque reminder of the truth she had denied. You think you can escape me? The reflection murmured softly, its voice like the grinding of stone against bone. It reached out again, its fingers brushing Mara's skin, sending a chill through her entire being. You can't outrun yourself, Mara. You never could. Mara's legs trembled, her body threatening to collapse under the weight of the revelation. She wanted to scream, to push the reflection away, but it was as though her body had been taken over by something else, something beyond her control. The darkness in the room felt alive now, pulsing with an energy that seemed to feed off her fear, her hopelessness. No, Mara whispered, her voice barely audible. No, this isn't real. You're not me. You're something else. Something evil. The reflection smiled, a twisted, cruel smile that sent a shiver crawling down Mara's spine. Evil, it repeated, its voice dripping with mockery. You think of me as evil. You think I am something outside of you? No, Mara, I am you, the parts of you that you refuse to see. The parts you fear. The parts you've hidden away so carefully, pretending they don't exist. Mara recoiled, a wave of nausea crashing over her. She wanted to look away, to escape, but the reflection's eyes, their hollowness, their emptiness, pulled her in. It was as if it could see through her, into the very core of her being, and for the first time, Mara felt utterly naked, utterly exposed. Do you remember? The reflection asked, its voice now a slow, deliberate whisper. Do you remember what you've done? The things you've hidden from the world, from yourself, the choices that shaped you into who you are now. The words sliced through Mara like a blade. She wanted to deny it. She wanted to scream, to fight back against the suffocating weight of the truth. But the memory was there, creeping into the corners of her mind, a memory she had pushed down for so long. She stammered, her heart hammering in her chest. I haven't done anything. I've lived a good life. I've tried so hard. The reflection's eyes gleamed with cruel understanding. Tried? You've tried to bury it all, to pretend it doesn't exist. But it's always been here, hasn't it? Lurking in the dark corners of your soul, waiting for you to face it, waiting for you to admit what you've done. Mara's breath caught in her throat as the memories began to flood back, sharp and overwhelming. The faces of people she had hurt, the lies she had told, the choices she had made out of fear and selfishness. It all came crashing down on her, a tidal wave of guilt and regret. She had spent so long pretending to be someone she wasn't, hiding the truth from others, and more importantly, from herself. You killed him, didn't you? The reflection whispered, its voice low and dangerous. You killed him and then buried it. You lied, you manipulated. You became someone you never wanted to be. But deep down, you knew. You always knew. Mara's knees buckled beneath her, and she fell to the floor, her head spinning. The reflection's words echoed in her mind, twisting and warping like a sinister mantra. She wanted to block them out, to deny them, but she couldn't. It was all true. It had always been true. Her mind went back to that night, the night she had tried to bury the truth, the night she had silenced the one person who had ever truly seen her, the night when she had crossed a line she could never uncross, the night when she had killed him. Her pulse raced as the memory enveloped her, suffocating her with its weight. The argument, the anger, the desperation, the moment when she had pushed him. Just once, too hard. His body hitting the ground, his breath leaving him, never to return. I didn't mean it. She had told herself over and over, I didn't mean it. But the reflection before her knew better. It knew the truth that she had tried to bury, the truth that had been festering inside her, waiting for this moment to come. And now that truth was standing right in front of her, mocking her, accusing her. You thought you could move on, didn't you? The reflection continued, its voice rising with an eerie sense of satisfaction. You thought that by pretending it didn't happen, you could leave it all behind. But you can't, Mara. It's always here, inside you. It's who you are. Mara gasped for breath, her chest tightening, her vision swimming. She wanted to scream, to shout, to make the reflection go away. But she knew it wouldn't, it couldn't, because the reflection wasn't just a monster. It wasn't just some manifestation of her guilt. It was a part of her that had always been there, a part that had always been waiting to rise up. The room around her seemed to distort again, the walls closing in, the shadows creeping closer, the reflection's smile twisted, becoming something grotesque, something truly monstrous. It reached out, its hand brushing against Mara's cheek, sending a jolt of icy terror through her body. "This is who you are," it whispered softly, its breath cold against her ear. "This is what you were always meant to be, a killer, a liar, a coward." Mara recoiled, shaking her head, but the reflection's grip on her mind was unrelenting. The darkness pressed in from all sides, suffocating her, drowning her in her own despair. She could feel her sanity slipping away, her thoughts unraveling like a frayed rope, caught in the tangled web of guilt and fear. But then, just as she thought she might collapse entirely, a strange clarity began to creep into her mind. A faint whisper, soft and distant, rose above the deafening din of the reflection's voice. Fight back. The thought was so quiet, so simple, but it felt like a lifeline thrown to her in the middle of the storm. She took a deep, shuddering breath, forcing her focus back to the reflection before her, forcing her thoughts to sharpen. "No," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "No, I'm not you. I'm not that person anymore." The reflection tilted its head, a mocking smile curling on its lips. "You can't escape me," it whispered. "You can never escape yourself." But Mara, despite the crushing weight of fear, despite the suffocating grip of her guilt, felt something stir within her. A flicker of defiance, a spark of resistance. "I can," she whispered back, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I can change. I don't have to be this. I don't have to be you." The reflection's smile faltered, its eyes narrowing as though it was momentarily taken aback by her sudden defiance. But before it could respond, Mara pushed herself to her feet, her legs unsteady but determined. She had to face this. She had to confront the darkness that had defined her for so long, not just in the world around her, but in herself. "I am more than this," she declared, her voice shaking with conviction. "I will be more." And with that, she stepped forward into the suffocating shadows, determined to break free from the very thing that had once threatened to consume her. Chapter 7. The return of the forgotten Mara stood at the edge of the ancient forest, her heart thumping in her chest as she stared into the darkness. The trees, towering and twisted, seemed to stretch endlessly into the night, their gnarled branches like skeletal hands reaching out, beckoning her forward. A cold wind stirred the air, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and decay. It was a smell that clung to her skin, to her clothes, as though the forest itself was absorbing her very essence. She had come here for a reason, but what that reason was, she wasn't entirely sure. Since confronting the reflection in the abandoned house, since facing the darkness inside herself, Mara had felt different. The weight of her past, the suffocating guilt that had haunted her every waking moment, had lessened in a way she couldn't quite explain. But at the same time, a new kind of unease had taken its place. The world felt wrong. There were things watching her from the shadows, things that whispered her name in the dead of night, things that waited for her to slip, to break. And so, she found herself here, standing before the forest she had avoided her entire life, as though something was calling her back. There had always been a forbidden pull toward this place, something deep within her soul that told her never to enter, never to seek out the truth buried here. But that truth, her truth, was something she could no longer ignore. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and a soft, rhythmic thudding sounded in the distance. It was the same sound she had heard on that fateful night, the night when her entire life had shattered, the night when she had buried everything in darkness, when she had tried to forget the horrifying truth about herself. "It's all connected," she thought, as she took a trembling step forward. A voice whispered in the back of her mind, "You shouldn't be here." But Mara ignored it. She had ignored the warnings for too long. The path before her was narrow, overgrown with brambles and roots that seemed to crawl like serpents beneath her feet. Every step she took felt heavier than the last, as though the earth itself was trying to pull her down, to swallow her whole. The deeper she ventured, the more the trees seemed to close in around her, their trunks twisting in unnatural shapes, their leaves whispering words she couldn't understand. This place isn't normal, she thought, her pulse quickening. And yet, it felt familiar, too familiar. She reached the clearing. The air here was thicker, stifling, as if the trees themselves held their breath, waiting. At the center of the clearing was an ancient stone circle, its surface covered in moss and ivy, the markings on the stones barely visible through centuries of decay. The wind died, and a deafening silence settled in, pressing down on her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She couldn't move, she couldn't breathe. The stone circle was no mere relic of the past. It was a gateway, a doorway, and it was waiting for her. Mara closed her eyes, but the memories flooded back, sharp and unforgiving. She saw her mother standing at the threshold of this very place, her face pale, her eyes wide with fear and sorrow. She saw the ritual, the forbidden pact, the blood that had been spilled. She remembered the words her mother had whispered to her, words she had never truly understood. "You must never come here, Mara. Never come here or the darkness will claim you." But it was too late for warnings now. She had crossed the line. "Mara!" The voice came from behind her, cold and smooth, like a blade sliding through the air. She turned, but there was nothing there, only the shadows, flickering and shifting in the corners of her vision. But the voice was real. Mara! Her name again, but this time it was softer, more intimate. The darkness swirled, thickening, as though it was alive. It was coming for her. It knew her name, and it knew her secrets. She stepped forward, her footfall soundless on the soft ground, and the stone circle seemed to pulse with a low rhythmic hum, like the beating of a heart. The stones began to glow, faintly at first, then brighter, brighter still, until the air around her seemed to crackle with energy. It was as though the very fabric of reality was bending, warping around her, the past and present colliding in a single moment. "Mara," the voice whispered again, this time right beside her ear. The breath of it sent a cold shiver down her spine, and she turned quickly, expecting to see someone, something, standing there. But there was nothing. Nothing but the swirling shadows. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers grazing the nearest stone. As soon as her skin touched the cool surface, the world around her seemed to distort. The trees warped, the shadows twisted, and the very air became thick with malice. The ground beneath her feet gave way, and she stumbled, falling to her knees. The voice was louder now, coming from all directions. It was no longer just a whisper. It was a chorus of voices, all speaking at once, all calling her name. "Mara, Mara, come back!" She clutched her head in agony, trying to block out the overwhelming sound. But the voices grew louder, more insistent, drowning her in their clamoring demands. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the voices stopped. The silence was deafening. Mara opened her eyes, and the world before her was no longer the forest she had entered. It was something else, something ancient, something out of time. The stone circle was still there, but the stones were no longer just stones. They were alive, their surfaces rippling with energy, their runes shifting and changing as if they had a mind of their own. She stood in the center of the circle now, the air around her thick with the weight of forgotten rituals. There was a presence here, an intelligence, ancient and powerful. It was watching her, waiting. And then, in the stillness, something moved. A shadow, small at first, like the flicker of a flame in the corner of her eye. It twisted, curling around the stone, growing larger, more solid. The shape of it was indistinct, but there was something deeply familiar about it. Her pulse quickened. It stepped closer, and Mara's breath caught in her throat as the shape began to take form. A figure emerged from the shadows, tall and regal, its features hidden beneath a dark hooded cloak. But Mara knew who it was. She knew it even before the figure raised its head and locked eyes with her. Her heart stuttered in her chest. "Mother," she whispered, her voice trembling. The figure before her smiled, a smile so cold, so empty, it made Mara's skin crawl. The shadows around them seemed to bend in response, as though the very essence of the world was bending to the figure's will. "You shouldn't have come here, Mara," the figure said softly, its voice familiar yet distant, like an echo of something long lost. "You've awakened what should remain dormant." Mara stepped back, her hands shaking. I didn't mean to. I didn't." "You never do," the figure interrupted, its voice sharp as a knife. "But now, there's no turning back. You've opened the door, and you will pay the price." Mara opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. The world around her seemed to collapse, the shadows consuming her, pulling her deeper into the darkness. And then, in the silence that followed, the figure spoke again. "You have no idea what you've unleashed." Chapter 8. The Breach. The darkness seemed to pulse around her, thick and suffocating, like a living entity wrapped tightly around Mara's chest. She tried to take a deep breath, but the air was oppressive, thick with the scent of decay and the weight of centuries-old secrets. Her heartbeat echoed in her ears as she stood before the stone circle, her hands trembling, still lingering where her mother's figure had vanished. She could still feel the chilling touch of the shadows brushing against her skin, seeping into her bones. The forest around her had grown unnaturally still. Not a leaf stirred in the breeze. The very trees stood as silent sentinels, their twisted branches casting grotesque shapes against the inky black sky. It was as though the world had stopped, holding its breath, waiting for something, waiting for her. Mara's mind raced. She had known this place was cursed, that there was a price to be paid for the knowledge hidden here. But what was it? What had she unleashed? The vision of her mother's cold, empty smile haunted her thoughts, the words she had spoken echoing in her mind. "You've opened the door, and you will pay the price." The ground beneath her feet trembled, just slightly, as though something deep within the earth was awakening. The silence was broken by a low rumble, distant at first, but growing louder with each passing second. It was the sound of something monstrous stirring, something ancient and forgotten. The very fabric of the world seemed to crack, splitting between the living and the dead, between the past and the future. Mara stepped back, her heart racing, but her feet felt rooted to the ground. She couldn't move. The forest was closing in on her, the trees leaning toward her like the fingers of some monstrous creature reaching out to claim her. The shadows seemed to stretch toward her, their tendrils curling and twisting, warping the very space around her. A voice whispered from the depths of the darkness, soft at first but growing louder and more distinct with each passing moment. "Mara." It was the voice of her mother again, but it was not the same. This voice was colder, more distant, and it carried with it a deep, unnatural power. "You have come too far." Mara's pulse quickened, her eyes wide as she searched the shadows for the source of the voice. "What is this? What do you want from me?" The wind suddenly picked up, howling through the trees, but there was no movement in the branches. The air was thick with the smell of rotting leaves, and the faint taste of ash lingered in her mouth. The voice spoke again, but now it was no longer her mother's voice. It was something darker, something that seemed to echo from the very depths of the earth. "You cannot escape now. You have summoned what should never have been woken. You have opened the breach." The ground beneath her feet began to crack, deep fissures forming in the earth, sending thick tendrils of black smoke curling up from the void. From within those cracks, something stirred. Mara could feel it, the presence pressing against her mind, pushing its way into her thoughts, into her very soul. It was ancient, insatiable, and it had been waiting for this moment, for her. With a sharp gasp, she staggered back, her foot slipping into the crack in the earth. She reached out, but there was nothing to grasp, nothing to hold on to. The ground beneath her feet gave way entirely, and she plunged into the darkness. The air around her shifted as she fell, the world twisting and turning, every sensation magnified to an unbearable degree. The sound of her heartbeat thudded in her ears, the rush of air filling her lungs as she plummeted downward. Her body felt weightless, lost in the void, until at last, with a sickening lurch, she landed hard on the cold stone floor. For a long moment she lay there, breathless, disoriented, her body aching from the fall. The silence was deafening, the weight of the darkness pressing in from all sides. She could feel it. The presence, pulsing in the air, brushing against her skin, surrounding her like a living thing. She slowly rose to her feet, her knees shaking, and looked around. She was no longer in the forest. The walls of the cavern were smooth, slick with an unnatural sheen, and the air smelled stale, like dust and forgotten things. The shadows were thick here, like they had substance, like they were waiting for her to make a move. The faintest glow from far away illuminated the cavern, casting long, shifting shadows across the uneven floor. "Mara!" The voice again, calling her name, soft and insistent. She turned toward the sound but saw nothing. A sudden chill ran through her spine, a deep visceral fear clawing at the back of her mind. The voice wasn't coming from the shadows this time. It was coming from behind her. Slowly, she turned around. Standing at the edge of the light, just outside her vision, was a figure cloaked in black, its face obscured by a hood. She could not make out its features, but she could feel its gaze on her, cold, calculating, watching. It stepped forward, its movement fluid, almost predatory, and as it came closer, Mara felt an overwhelming sense of dread settle over her. She opened her mouth to speak, to demand answers, but no words came. The figure raised a gloved hand and gestured to the cavern walls, where strange symbols were etched into the stone. They seemed to pulse with an eerie light, their meanings lost to time but undeniably powerful. "These," the figure's voice rasped, "are the markings of the ancients, those who dwelled here before the world was made. They were the ones who opened the breach. And now, it is your turn." Mara's heart slammed against her ribs, the weight of the words crashing down on her like a tidal wave. "The breach?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper, her throat dry. "The breach," the figure repeated, its voice filled with cold amusement, "is what you have awakened. A rift between worlds, between life and death, between the living and the dead. And you have torn it open." Mara took a step back, her mind racing. "No, I didn't mean to." "Meaning matters not," the figure interrupted, stepping closer, its footsteps echoing ominously in the cavern. "The breach is now open, and once it has been opened, it cannot be closed. Not by you, not by anyone." The shadows around them seemed to shift, thickening, swirling, like smoke that had a mind of its own. Mara could feel the temperature drop, the very air growing colder, heavier, as if something was coming, something huge, something ancient. She turned her gaze back to the figure, her eyes wide with terror. "What have I done?" she whispered. The figure's lips curled into something like a smile, though there was no warmth in it, only the chill of the void. "You have summoned the end, Mara. You have summoned the darkness, and now it will come for you." As the figure spoke, the shadows began to move, stretching, twisting, reaching toward her, enveloping her in their suffocating embrace. Mara stumbled back, her feet scrambling for purchase on the slick stone, but there was nowhere to run. The darkness was closing in, and the air was thick with the scent of death. And then, out of the shadows, a figure emerged. It was a woman, tall and thin, her face pale, her hair dark as pitch. She was dressed in tattered black robes, and her eyes, when she lifted her head, glowed with an eerie, unearthly light. Her gaze locked onto Mara's, and for a moment, it felt as though the very earth trembled beneath her feet. "Mara," the woman said softly, her voice laced with a twisted affection. "Welcome home." Chapter 9. The Echoes of the Forgotten. The labyrinth stretched endlessly before Mara, each passage indistinguishable from the last. Her footsteps echoed in the dark, rhythmic and hollow, as if the very stone beneath her feet was holding its breath. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and rot, curling into her lungs with every breath. But it wasn't just the smell of decay that unsettled her. No, It was something deeper, something ancient that hung in the air like a curse, suffocating her. Every now and then, the flicker of distant torchlight danced on the walls, casting long, wavering shadows that seemed to follow her every movement. Her mind raced, each pulse of her heart a reminder that she was not alone. Not truly. The shadows themselves whispered, soft and incoherent, like a chorus of voices, ancient and knowing, trapped between worlds. She could hear them now, just behind her, their whispers creeping under her skin, curling around her thoughts, threatening to drown her. Come closer. The voice, soft and familiar, echoed in her mind, a whisper from deep within the maze. It felt like a beckoning, like an invitation. But the thought made her stomach churn. There was something wrong about it, something insidious about the way it wormed its way into her mind. Come closer, Mara. You are almost there. She shook her head, trying to dislodge the thought, but it clung to her like a shadow, pulling at her sanity. The walls around her seemed to close in, the passage narrowing, as if the labyrinth itself were alive, reshaping itself to trap her. Her breath came quicker, the walls pressing down on her chest with every exhale, every breath feeling more labored than the last. Panic was setting in, but she refused to give in to it. Not again. Not like before. Her hand tightened around the amulet her mother had left her, the only thing that seemed to anchor her to the world she once knew. The amulet glowed faintly, a soft light in the consuming darkness, but it did little to ease the growing dread in her heart. She pressed on, despite the voices that whispered her name, despite the suffocating pressure that seemed to close in from all sides. You have come far, Mara, farther than they ever intended, farther than you ever intended. The voice was sharper now, clearer, and something about it made her blood run cold. She turned abruptly, expecting to see the shadows pressing in on her, but there was nothing, just the same endless stone, the same shifting darkness. Her breath hitched in her throat as the voice continued, its cold, metallic tone growing louder, more insistent. You cannot escape what you have summoned. You cannot outrun it. The labyrinth seemed to twist and warp around her, the walls stretching, the passageways bending at unnatural angles, as if the very architecture was alive, shifting in response to her every move. The shadows swirled around her like living creatures, reaching out to her with gnarled fingers, trailing their cold touch across her skin. Her mind reeled. How had she come to this place? Was this the same labyrinth she had fallen into before? Or was it something else? Had she crossed into another world entirely, a place where the rules of time and space no longer held sway? The answer came in the form of a soft, musical laughter that seemed to resonate from all around her, echoing off the stone walls. It was a laugh that made her skin crawl, a laugh that she recognized all too well. Mara! The voice cooed, dripping with malice. Do you think you can escape me? She froze. The sound of the laughter faded, replaced by an unbearable silence. For a moment, Mara couldn't hear anything but the pounding of her own heartbeat in her ears. She swallowed hard, her breath shallow, as she turned slowly, dread pooling in her stomach like a heavy stone. And then she saw it, the figure. It was standing in the shadows at the far end of the corridor, tall and impossibly thin, with a face shrouded in darkness. Its features were impossible to discern, but Mara could feel its eyes on her, cold and empty, burning through the shadows like twin pools of black fire. Its limbs stretched unnaturally long, reaching toward her, but it made no move to approach. No, it was waiting, watching. The voice, now unmistakably hers, came from it. You've opened the door, Mara. You've released what should never have been freed. And now you will pay. Mara could feel her body trembling, her throat dry, her legs threatening to give out beneath her. The shadows in the labyrinth began to swirl more aggressively, their forms becoming more defined, more solid, as if they had weight, substance, as if they were tangible. They pressed in on her from all sides, suffocating her, squeezing the air from her lungs. No, she whispered, her voice raw with fear. No, I didn't mean to. But it didn't matter. It never mattered. The labyrinth was closing in on her, and the figure, The thing with the hollow eyes was all that remained. It began to step toward her, its movements slow and deliberate. Each step it took caused the air to grow colder, thicker, as if each stride was pulling the very warmth from the world. The shadows responded, reaching toward Mara, their fingers grasping for her very soul. She could feel them pulling at her, tugging, trying to drag her into the abyss. "Mara!" The figure's voice crooned again, a whispered command that felt like an iron fist wrapping around her chest. "Come closer. Come into the darkness." Her heart raced, each beat a drum of terror as she backed away, her mind scrambling for an escape, for any way out of this place. But there was no escape. There was no way out. The labyrinth had closed off all paths, but the one leading straight to the thing that waited for her in the shadows. She spun around, searching desperately for some way out, but the walls were pressing in, the passage narrowing with every step she took. There was nowhere left to run. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her hands trembling as she reached for the amulet, clutching it tightly, as though its faint glow could protect her from what was coming. And then, in the distance, she heard it, the sound of footsteps. Someone was coming. Someone was approaching, but it wasn't a human's footfall. It was slow, deliberate, as though the very ground beneath it trembled in fear. The figure, the thing that had been stalking her, paused, its head tilting slightly, as though listening, as though it too had heard the sound. Mara's pulse quickened. She could feel the change in the air, a shift in the energy around her. Something was different now. The walls seemed to bend and pulse, the very atmosphere heavy with anticipation. "It has come. The darkness has come to claim you." But Mara did not listen to the words. She didn't have time for them. She was running now, running with all her might, her feet pounding against the stone floor, her heart in her throat, her mind only on one thing: escape. She wasn't sure how long she had been running, the passageways blurred together in a haze of darkness and despair, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't. And then, suddenly, she burst into a wide, cavernous room. It was unlike anything she had seen before. A vast, open space with a ceiling that seemed to stretch on forever. The walls were covered in strange, glowing symbols, their lines pulsing with an eerie light. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, upon which rested a dark, obsidian sphere. It hummed with power, its surface reflecting an otherworldly glow. As she stepped into the room, the shadows recoiled, slithering back into the corners, as though afraid of the light. Mara's eyes were drawn to the sphere, to its dark, endless depths. She could feel the pull of it, the same pull that had drawn her to the labyrinth in the first place, the same pull that had brought her here. But as she approached, something stopped her. A voice, a deep, resonant whisper that came from within the sphere itself. "Do you seek answers, Mara?" The voice was not the same as the one that had tormented her in the maze. It was ancient, timeless, and its words were a call from beyond the veil. "Do you seek the truth of what you have awakened?" Mara reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the sphere, torn between fear and curiosity. She had come this far after all. What was one more step? And as her fingers brushed against the surface, the world around her seemed to shudder. Chapter 10. The Breaking Point. The sphere pulsed under Mara's touch, its surface vibrating with an unnatural energy that seemed to seep into her very bones. The light from the symbols on the walls flickered, casting erratic shadows across the room. It was as though the entire labyrinth had stilled, holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable. The whispers, those soft, maddening voices that had followed her, now became louder, more insistent, as if they were calling to her, coaxing her closer to the darkness. She stepped forward, heart hammering in her chest. Her fingers barely brushed the surface of the sphere, but the effect was immediate. The room seemed to tremble, the stone beneath her feet groaning in protest, as the air turned thick, heavy with power. The symbols on the walls began to shift, their once static patterns now swirling like ink in water, drawing her in. The voice inside her mind, the same cold whisper she had heard before, filled her thoughts once more. It was no longer a question, it was a command. "Come closer, Mara. You must know the truth. It is too late to turn back." Mara's breath caught in her throat. She wanted to pull away, to turn and run, but the pull was irresistible. The sphere seemed to call to her, a black hole that consumed all light and warmth, threatening to swallow her whole. Her hand hovered above it, trembling, but something deep within her urged her forward. She had come this far, after all. What was one more step? What was one more moment of surrender? The voices grew louder, a cacophony of whispers that echoed through her mind, rattling her sanity. They spoke in a language she did not understand, a guttural, ancient dialect that resonated deep within her chest. It was a language of promises and curses, a language older than the earth itself, a language that beckoned her to the edge of oblivion. Mara took a deep breath, her fingers closing around the cold surface of the sphere. And in that moment, everything changed. The world around her cracked open, the labyrinth, the dark corridors, the twisting passages, the endless shadows, shattered into fragments, each piece splintering like glass. She was no longer in the stone room, no longer surrounded by the cold embrace of the labyrinth. The walls had dissolved, leaving her in a vast, empty void, a sea of darkness that stretched infinitely in every direction. There was no sky, no ground, no horizon. There was only the blackness and the oppressive weight of something ancient, something that had been waiting for her. The sphere in her hand throbbed with a rhythmic pulse, sending shockwaves of energy through her body. She felt her veins burn with a fire that was not her own, her mind fracturing, splintering under the weight of a truth she was not ready to hear. "You have broken it," the voice whispered again, but this time, it was no longer her own. It was something else, something far older, far more terrifying. "You have opened the door that was never meant to be opened." Her vision blurred as the void around her began to shift, warping and bending in impossible ways. Shapes, shadows perhaps, moved in the corners of her sight, but when she turned to look, they were gone. The air was thick with a sense of presence, a presence that was not of this world. It was like the very fabric of reality was coming undone. "You have released it," the voice continued, growing louder, more insistent. "The darkness, the thing that has slumbered for eons. It will come for you. It will come for all of them." The words were suffocating, pressing against her mind, filling her head with 1,000 impossible thoughts, 1,000 impossible truths. And then, as the weight of those words settled upon her, she understood. She understood what she had done, what she had unleashed. The labyrinth was not merely a place. It was a prison for something that had been bound, locked away for eternity. And now, the door was open. The chains had been broken, and the thing that had been imprisoned was coming. The ground beneath her feet began to tremble, a low, ominous rumble that seemed to reverberate through her very soul. The air grew cold, impossibly cold, and Mara's breath came in sharp gasps, misting in front of her. The darkness around her deepened, swirling like a storm, and she felt the oppressive weight of something ancient and malevolent pressing down on her. She tried to move, to run, but her legs were like lead, frozen in place by the sheer force of the presence that loomed over her. The darkness seemed to be alive, writhing, slithering, as if it had a mind of its own. And then, she saw it, a shape emerging from the void, a figure more massive than anything she could have imagined. It was a shadow, but it was not like any shadow she had ever seen. It was a living, breathing thing, its form shifting and undulating, as though it were made of the very darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were vast empty voids, sucking in the light around them, devouring everything in their path. Mara's heart skipped a beat as the creature moved toward her, its presence overwhelming. The very air seemed to be pulled toward it, drawn into its abyssal gaze. She could feel its hunger, its infinite need for something. Perhaps for her, perhaps for all of humanity. "You have unleashed it," the voice repeated, the words now a mournful wail, echoing in the void. "And now it will feed. It will feed on everything." Mara tried to scream, but no sound came. Her mouth was dry, her body stiff with terror. She was trapped, bound by the weight of her own choices, her own folly. There was no escape, no way out. The creature loomed closer, its form taking shape, its dark tendrils reaching toward her like 1,000 hungry hands. And then, in a voice that was both deafening and whisper-soft, it spoke. "You are the first, Mara. You opened the door. But you will not be the last." The world around her began to crumble, the very fabric of reality breaking apart as the creature drew closer. Mara's vision darkened, her senses overloaded by the sheer intensity of what she was witnessing. And then, with a sudden violent surge, everything went black.